Hi, welcome once again to Senior Focus. I'm your host, Bill Adams. Senior Focus is a show designed for adults over the age of about 50 or so, and we bring you information and news of programs in the area, but also we like to bring local history to you so that we could talk about things that we might not know about this area.
Right.
And in that vein, well, before we get started, I want to thank Greg Roten from Armstrong, who brings the show to you, and also thanks to the public library, who allows us to use their meeting rooms. But today's guest has been a long-time guest. I guess
Right, sure.
I keep going back to the Johnny Carson show when he would have regular guests.
Right.
We're not the Carson show, but Tom Welsh is a writer and an author, and has a brand new book.
Oh, thank you, Bill.
And what's the name?
Well, this book I co-authored with two other gentlemen, Joshua Foster and Gordy Morgan. Gordon, of course, was the co-author of Classic Restaurants of Youngstown. This is called Jewish Youngstown and the Steel Valley, and it's an attempt to tell the story of the Jewish community from 1837 to the present in about 280 pages. It was kind of a challenge.
Yeah, that's got to be tough. What
Right.
do you leave out, and what do you?
Most of what you leave out is it's not critical material, but it's material that might have amplified what's already there. Mm-hmm. And I can give you an example of the kinds of tough decisions we had to make involved maybe the tail end of stories that made them more compelling.
Okay.
Like, for instance, you may have read the story about there were a couple of Youngstown area residents who found themselves in Austro-Hungary, what was then Austro-Hungary,
Oh, right. Okay.
during the outbreak of World War I. Mm-hmm. And one of them was a gentleman by the name of Jacob Eigner, who ran a business in Briar Hill. And this part of the story we tell is that he went back to Austria to visit his mother. He was caught up in the war, despite his American citizenship, was drafted and sent to the Eastern Front, no less.
Oh, boy.
Refused to fight, and was court-martialed and shot, which is outrageous. Okay?
Right,
That's
American citizen, yeah.
That's right, and we have that part of the story. What we had to cut was the addendum to that story, which is that the Austrian consulate in Cleveland actually petitioned his bank for his $10,000 bank account.
Oh.
And it was only a Jewish fraternal organization that apparently prevented that from happening. So it goes from being a story that's outrageous to a story that makes the blood boil. And those are the kinds of decisions we had to make.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, there was another, I remember that story. Wasn't there another person who was able to escape because of...
Yes, Abe Sobner, I believe.
Faked that he was a soldier? Is that
That's right, that's right. There was he was very enterprising. He was in Hungary visiting relatives, and he found that all the trains leaving Budapest heading west were reserved for troops.
Right.
So he posed as a soldier. And then when he arrived in Germany, at that point he thought it was appropriate to show his papers so that he
Right.
he could leave. But
Let him off the train.
They let him off the train, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing about that period, too, is that, about the period of World War I, is that you had the American Jewish Committee already being very aware of atrocities committed by both sides targeting the Jewish community. So you see a lot of premonitions of what was to come during
Right.
the First World War.
Right. Well, the origins, I guess, of the Jewish community go back to, was it Mr. Spiegel? Was he the...
Yes, Jacob Spiegel. And a lot of people are very surprised by that because they tend to think of maybe the Jewish community as getting here probably in the late 19th century, and a lot of Eastern European Jews arrived at that time, particularly Russian Jews. But people don't realize that when this was still a pioneer town, a gentleman named Jacob Spiegel arrived in Old Town, and if you want to visit Old Town today, you'll need scuba diving.
Okay.
It's beneath the Meander Reservoir. But
Makes it tough for research. Huh?
That's right. There's not much field research on Old Town. But in any case, he very soon settled in Youngstown proper and was joined by a couple of other young Jewish immigrants. So people don't realize that the community was fairly established by the mid 19th century.
Okay. Yeah. In fact, just after the war, Civil War, that is the first congregation, or
That's
the
correct.
the one we know today, right?
Congregation Road of Shalom is celebrating its 150th anniversary, and yes, that's correct. And the community was getting together for services informally before that, minions, But that was the first congregation, yeah.
Yeah, and they were part of it, what, the Reform movement?
Which is interesting,
yeah.
too, because that was one of the things that, in fact, one of the unfortunate, on the whole, we were very, very pleased with the editing of the book and loved the presentation. One of the things that was changed that I think becomes misleading is that the book indicates that Youngstown's Jewish community is the second oldest Jewish community in Ohio after Cleveland. It says after. Well, what it originally said, with Cleveland.
Okay.
So we are not the third. Our community is actually, our Jewish community is actually the second oldest, tied with Cleveland.
Okay.
And so the roots of the community are much deeper than many people suspect. It was also one of the oldest Reform congregations in the Midwest.
And these were German, generally?
These were generally German and Austrian Jews who were, more open to assimilation at that point. And in fact, people are sometimes surprised to see a picture of a rabbi from that period wearing what appears to be a clerical collar.
Oh, okay.
So someone walking into a Reformed congregation at a certain point in history might almost think they were walking into a Protestant service. So, yeah, very, very different than some of the groups that came later were more traditional in their approach to worship.
Right.
Yeah.
And I like how you stitched, the history of Youngstown in with this book. But there was just one fact that jumped out at me. Well, there were many, but you have in here that by the turn of the century, and this would be about 1900, more rail cars went under the Center Street Bridge per day than any other location in the country.
Yes, this was an industrial hub, and the other thing that surprises people is that in the 1840s, the Eagle was actually, which was financed by David Todd, was the largest blast furnace in the Midwest.
Okay.
So we forget sometimes what an industrial hub this was, and of course that has a lot. The industrial development of the community has a lot to do with the fact that we had so much diversity after a certain point. I think in 1900 the dominant ethnic group in Youngstown was Welsh.
Oh, really?
And by 1920, that was no longer the case.
Okay.
I think it's very significant. Maybe 50% of the population or more was foreign-born. So we went through a major demographic change because of the kinds of developments you just mentioned. Yeah.
Well, and as far as the Jewish members of Youngstown or as citizens, it seems like they tended to be in professions or retail. Is that a good analysis?
It's an interesting. There was an interesting trend in the Jewish community, and in fact, there was a lot of concern on the part of the more established Jewish residents, who, again, as you mentioned, were mainly Germanic. They were concerned actually because the Eastern European Jews were more exotic, that they might demean their status. But one of the things about those more recent arrivals was that they, unlike their counterparts from those areas, they were not farmers. They basically were people who had trades. They were self-employed. And when they came to America, in many ways, they were very, very prepared for the kind of market economy we have.
Right.
And they did very, very well within a short period of time.
Well, and some of this, I think of the Strauss family in Hirschberg,
right,
where, that sort of dovetails with your prior book.
Right, oh yeah.
And, well, at this point, maybe it would take a little side route or time out, but
sure.
Is that how you got involved in this? Because from your other previous research?
It's interesting, and that would seem to be a natural progression, but what actually happened was I was commissioned to do this book first.
Okay.
And that was, for a lot of people were surprised to hear that. And essentially what happened is my first book, of course, was a published dissertation, and it was on the decline of Youngstown's Catholic schools, all the factors that contributed to the steep decline between 1960 and 2006. And Sherry Lincoln, on the basis of, who was at that point co-director of the YSU Center for Working Class Studies, was aware of that. She was also aware of of some of the other work I was doing in the community. I was doing interviews for Steel Valley Voices. And a committee got together and asked me if I'd be interested in doing this project. Well, we approached a couple of publishers, and many of the university presses actually said, we'll do it for like it was like $25,000. And that was not what we anticipated, especially, I had an academic background. So we finally approached the History Press, and they were interested in the project, but they were concerned about the fact that my only book at that point was a published dissertation. So they said, well, why don't you do these two books first? And as it turns out, as you mentioned, both of them were much more richer topics than I initially anticipated. Both, of course, overlap with this topic because, of course, Isaac Strauss and Bernard Hirschberg were both German Jewish immigrants.
Right.
Many of the most beloved restaurants in Youngstown, in the Youngstown area, of course, were Jewish owned. The 20th century, the Mural Room, to name a couple, off the Ringside, another, And so yeah, those two books, in a sense, did help to prepare me for this book. Yes, even though this was commissioned earlier.
Yeah. Well, and it's fascinating how the history of the Jewish community here in Youngstown echoes what was going on internationally. Again, you talk about in the late 1800s, like in Russia.
Oh, yes.
There was a lot of horrible things going on at that time. And, maybe you could talk about how the local population, responded.
Well, you had a period of, sure, absolutely. There was a period of unrest. There was the assassination of a czar, and essentially the government, as governments often do, authoritarian governments in particular, in order to distract the public from revolutionary activities.
Right.
They started to target the Jewish population, and they orchestrated pogroms that were presented in the Russian media as spontaneous events. Okay. They created a situation where there were such limitations on Jewish residents. First of all, many were restricted to an area called the Pale. Were not allowed to enter the professions, and because of the whole, because of the institutional discrimination, the systematic discrimination of Jews in Imperial Russia, many of them came en masse to the United States during that period.
Right.
And events in Russia actually contributed to the rise of organizations that became very concerned about the conditions for European Jewry. They also contributed, as you can imagine, to growing support for Zionism. And one of the things that was interesting about the local reform community and the reform community at large was they were very, very much distanced themselves, at least at that point rather, from the idea of Judaism as a nationality. And but when you saw the rise of racialized anti-Semitism, not one that wasn't just a result of religious prejudice, but was kind of a distorted Darwinist, like what the Nazis eventually implemented. People began to more and more support the idea of Jewish homeland. And Chaim Weizmann was one of the guests, one of the many Zionist leaders who visited the Youngstown area.
Yeah, that was the early
1920s.
20s,
right?
yeah, okay.
Right. He of course became the first president of Israel. So that's not a footnote there. That's an interesting event.
Yeah, we had quite a few famous people come through Youngstown. That's one of the things I got out of the book. I mean, it was just fascinating to read about, like, for instance, the debate. There was a debate at Stambaugh.
Clarence Darrow and Rabbi Philo of Congregation Road of Sholom. And Rabbi Philo, of course, was a well-known speaker. He was supposed to be such an effective speaker that people would stand up and burst into spontaneous applause. He was one of those people.
We can only hope that happens on your book tour.
I hope so. Yeah, let's hope. But it was. Clarence Darrow, of course, as we know from the Scopes Monkey trial, was very antagonistic toward organized religion,
right.
And a very outspoken atheist. And of course, Rabbi Philo was taking the opposite tack.
Right. Religion's a good thing.
That's right. And so, but they had a debate at Stambaugh Auditorium. They actually had a series of debates, and And he apparently was came out on top by a narrow margin in terms of people's response to.
Yeah, in fact, wasn't there some sort of a poll that they did, right?
That's right.
Of the
right.
listeners, because at that
Right.
there was even radio involved, right?
Well, to come out on top when you're debating Clarence Darrow, even by a slim margin, is an accomplishment.
Right, right.
So.
And that particular rabbi was probably, at least according to the book, I mean, one of the main figures in the Jewish community here in Youngstown for many years, right?
Absolutely. In fact, I was privileged to interview a gentleman named Joseph Hill, who was approaching his centenary when I interviewed him. He'd come to Youngstown in 1920 as a youth. And I interviewed him when he was at Heritage Manor. And I.E. Philo, E. Philo was actually one of the heroes of his. I mean, he continually mentioned him as being someone who was not merely respected in the Jewish community, but at large, the community at large. And Welsh born, actually. He was born in Wales, and yeah, and I don't know what that had anything to do with his eloquence. I don't know, but he was a phenomenal speaker.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there are so many interesting characters. I mean, there was Mr. Wilkoff, I think, is one of the founders of Sheet and Tube.
That was one of the things that surprised me, because we all think of retail. We think of Strauss's, Lustig's, Livingston's, Haber's later on. You know, a lot of the landmark businesses in downtown Youngstown that many of us grew up with, and miss today. But we don't think about the role that Jewish immigrants played in the development of heavy industry, and it wasn't a big one in terms of numbers, but it was significant because William Wilkoff, a Lithuanian-born scrap dealer,
right?
Was one of
literally
the partners.
rags to riches. Yeah.
Literally rags to riches. That's exactly right, and he was one of the organizers, along with James Campbell, and I almost said James Cagney, James Campbell, and George D. Wick in the organization of the firm that eventually became Youngstown Sheet and Tube. The Kahn brothers established what became Trustcon Steel. The Karnak brothers, Russian Jewish immigrants, established Commercial Shearing, which they sold later, and of course, that company flourished for many years.
And speaking of the Kahns, it was Albert was the architect, and we see his work still downtown. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and an internationally renowned architect, and many of his landmark buildings are in Detroit as well, and that's where and interestingly enough, the Kahn brothers, who were German immigrants, but were for a time based in Detroit, made the decision to establish what became Trustcon Steel. I think it was Trust Concrete. I forget the
right.
But it was in any case, because of the high quality of steel in Youngstown and because of its availability, they could eliminate the transportation costs by having their manufacturing plant here in town.
Then we get, again, into some of the retail people that we all probably know if you're of a certain age. Lustig.
Oh, yes.
Livingston's.
And George Livingston was among the people we were able to interview. And that's probably a good thing to mention at this point, is that we did about 30 interviews in the course of doing the research in the book. And many of those interviews have been transcribed, and the digital recordings are down at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. And that was something they hoped we would do. Something else that happened in the process of writing and researching and writing up the book, and I should mention my co-authors, Joshua Foster, who was with the project from very early on, and he's actually Rose Kravitz's grandson, I should mention that,
okay.
And Jack Kravitz's nephew. He's based in Louisville, Kentucky, which would seem to be a disadvantage, but just a stone's throw from Hebrew Union College.
Oh, that's right.
It's Cincinnati, of course.
Yeah.
So he was able to do research there, and of course, growing up in the community, had knowledge that I wouldn't have. Okay, and also is a very, very strong researcher and historian. Gordy Morgan did research in Western Pennsylvania, and wrote up certain sections of the book, and also did the thankless job of transcribing many of the interviews. Have you ever done that?
No.
If you ever have, you would know that is truly a thankless job. But he both made wonderful contributions. In the process of doing the research, people gave us either originals or high-resolution reproductions of photographs
Okay.
that were not part of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society's collection at that point, because as we all know, there has always been a little bit of a divide between Youngstown and Warren. People in Warren, when they think about donating something, are maybe more oriented toward the Western Reserve Historical Society than the Mahoning Valley Historical Society.
Okay.
So we're able to supplement that collection. One of the most interesting artifacts that was donated was the portable ark used by Warren's Jewish community before the establishment of Temple Beth Israel in 1918. It was used between 1900 and 1918. So it was in someone's garage.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, and I wanted to mention that is that this is not only, again, Youngstown or Mahoning County, but you go in depth about Warren, about Sharon, about Farrell,
right.
the region. I guess.
There's a reason for that, and a lot of it has to do with one of the phenomenon we're all well aware of that was hastened in the wake of deindustrialization, and that is the decline in the population.
Right.
And of course, so as early as 1973, we have two conservative congregations, Temple Emmanuel and Anshiamith, merging, and of course the merged temple, the new edifice of the merged temple, now built in the 80s, is in Liberty, Temple Elameth. But by the early 1980s, you also saw the merger of Youngstown and Warren's Jewish Federation, as well as the Federation for Shenango County. So at this point, the Youngstown Area Jewish Federation comprises not only the Youngstown Warren area, but also parts of eastern Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania.
Right.
So, and that's been a product, and that's another thing that surprised me about the book. I think when people look at the visibility of the Jewish community, it's kind of outsized contributions to the area. They're surprised to learn that at its peak, the metropolitan area's Jewish community was about 8,500 people, and that was in 1930 when Youngstown's population was at its peak at about 170,000. And people think, really, they would be larger than that, and they're truly shocked when they learn that the population today is about 1,500, and that's no longer Youngstown or even the Youngstown Warren area. That comprises the whole region, comprising that is under the Federation.
So there's a dramatic decline in population.
And that's one of the concerns that many people have, right?
Well, going back to, say, the 30s, that seemed to be, again, the peak of the population.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'd say, just to me, the most interesting time, because you had things like the Warner Theater opening.
Absolutely.
What was the other, there was another major...
Strauss's.
Strauss's, yeah.
And Strauss's, and people, and of course, the Strauss's book was a wonderful preparation for this, and we didn't get to use a lot of material because we covered such a broad period of time. But the photograph that is on the cover and included within the book was taken during the grand opening of Strauss's flagship store in downtown Youngstown, which is still standing. And to give people an idea of how much fanfare was involved in the opening of this state-of-the-art department store, which was built by the same architects who built the flagship store of Saks Fifth Avenue.
Oh, okay.
The mayor, Mayor Scheibel, actually ordered a commercial pilot to circle the square and to drop a wreath that was attached to a silk parachute into the square. And at that point, it was supposed to be retrieved by the mayor, who was going to present it to Clarence Strauss. It actually got stuck in a cornice of the building, so it didn't go as smoothly as people planned. But you have that iconic picture, really, of Mayor Scheibel presenting the wreath to Clarence Strauss, the son of Isaac Strauss.
Right.
And that was, people forget what an event that was in local history. And of course, the Warner Brothers are just one example of people, of former Youngstown residents who made an impact not just regionally but nationally and internationally. And of course, the fact that they built a theater that was modeled on their Los Angeles theater It was the kind of theater you would see in a much larger metropolitan area as evidence of their roots here.
Yeah, it's a tremendous asset still to this day to the area.
Absolutely.
And we only have a few minutes to go, unfortunately. Maybe we'll have to do it in 2 parts. But
That'd be great.
But well, why don't we, before I forget, why don't we mention where the book can be purchased?
Yeah, the book actually, and what's interesting about this book, and I talked to someone involved in marketing at Arcadia Books and History Press, and they indicated that it's one of only about 12 titles that has been released in not only paperback but also hardcover.
Okay.
So, but the most widely available, of course, is the paperback, which is at about $21.99. $22.
Let's round it up. Yeah,
Right.
round it off.
It's at Barnes and Noble. It will be, if it isn't already, it will be at Walgreens in the area, at the Butler Art Institute, at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. Obviously, they collaborate on the book. It wouldn't be possible without them. It will be available at the gift shop at Fellows Garden, and it's also available online at just about every online bookseller: Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Books A Million.
Right.
So
it'll be available.
Widely available.
Widely available.
Widely available.
Well, again, we only have a couple minutes to go, but I didn't want to complete the interview without talking about, in the 30s, the Jewish Federation that started up. And you talked about the impact of the Jewish community maybe exceeding, the size of the people.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that's seen in maybe the Jewish Federation and some of the things that they did charitably in the area.
In fact, the Jewish Federation was established in large part, partly because there were so many Jewish charitable organizations, and people who wanted to be funders, wanted to be donors, found it overwhelming. And so that they became a kind of clearinghouse for those organizations. The other thing that was happening that led to the establishment of the Federation, the growth of the community itself, but also the crisis in Europe.
Right.
What was the crisis for European Jewry. And of course, Clarence Strauss, who looms large in this book and should, was the founding president of the Federation. And I think when you look at the Jewish community's contributions too, we can't forget the fact that it was, there was eventually the establishment of a very impressive Jewish infrastructure, which even to this day, with an extremely small population, includes 3 temples and other institutions. The Jewish community also played a big role in the establishment of local hospitals. Clarence Strauss was a major fundraiser for St. Elizabeth Hospital.
Right.
So across the board, tremendous contributions. And the Federation, of course, went through a period of tremendous growth after the war and remains a force in the region today.
Well, thank you. I think we've pretty much run out of time, unfortunately. But
Yes,
there are so many great stories, and again, maybe if people
Well, the
want to
one
go
that
see
I think you hope to get to was Ross Radio.
Yeah.
And Ross Radio, which is the second campus of Mahoning Valley Historical Society, also has a special role in local Jewish history because James Ross, who was a Russian-born Jewish immigrant, was very aware of the situation in Palestine. During the British Mandate, the Jewish settlers were stripped of their arms, and so there actually was a clandestine gun running operation.
Yeah.
Gun running
That's
operation
what it was.
in the basement of Ross Radio. So, and that is reflected in the fact that there's a historical marker there today. So a lot of rich history in this community.
Right. And again, these are things that happened locally that impacted not only our local area, but even internationally.
And we can't forget Arby's, too.
And Arby's. But that's in the book.
That's in the book, absolutely. Right.
So again, thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Bill, as always.
Talking to Tom Welsh. He is one of the 3 authors of the history of Jewish Youngstown and the Steel Valley. My name is Bill Adams. You've been watching Senior Focus on Armstrong Cable. Thank you to Greg Roten from Armstrong for bringing the show to you. And thanks to the Public Library of Youngstown and Mahoning County for allowing us to use the Austintown meeting room. And lastly, thanks to you for watching.